spoke with my class. It's gone really well. So she's just going to talk a little bit today about her work, and then afterwards we all get to go have cake and fun stuff at the exhibition opening. So just a little bit about her before we get started. She received her MFA from the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester, New York. She's since relocated to Minnesota, which is where she's done this recent series that you see in the exhibition. Her work has been exhibited nationally and internationally in Greece, Armenia, Brazil, New Zealand, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and New York. She's a recent recipient of an Artist Intuitive Grant in Media Studies from the Minnesota State Arts Board, which she is using to complete a combined stop-motion animation and live-motion short film entitled The Hidden. She currently teaches at St. Cloud State University and the College of St. Ben's and St. John's. She is finalizing preparations for a solo exhibition in October at the Center for Photography in Madison. So we were lucky to kind of sneak in and have her right before she goes there. So if you will join me in welcoming her.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate your time and coming to hear a little bit about my work. I'd love to thank Dr. Emily Newman for inviting me here to speak with you and share my work, as well as for curating the exhibition. I think she did a lovely job kind of looking through Completely Human, which actually is a series of about 35 photographs. She went and kind of boiled that down to a cohesive 14 that she really felt kind of talked about what she was looking at in terms of showcasing in the work. I also really like to thank Patty and Julie for the work they did on the exhibition, as well as Katie for the brochure. Lovely job. And also Brian did an excellent job installing the exhibition, so thank you so much. I had a wonderful day yesterday meeting with graduate students. It really was I really enjoyed looking at your work, and thank you for inviting me into your studios and trusting me to look at your work. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of a background on myself to kind of contextualize the work you see in the exhibition and kind of give you a nice kind of lineage of kind of where I am and how this kind of work came about. I actually started doing a lot of drawing, printmaking, and painting as an undergrad. I grew up making art at the kitchen table with my mother, who was a ceramicist. And to me, I loved working with my hands. I still kind of did a lot with exploring the sense of the body. It's actually a piece that directly related to a series of issues I had with weight when I was a young person. I suffered from anorexia. So it's a piece directly related to that. And so I was really focusing on the body, but using much more kind of fine art materials. And I actually kind of switched gears in undergrad and actually went and pursued a degree in psychology, where I studied human motivation and cognition. I was really interested in kind of delving more into the workings of the mind. For me, fine art just wasn't quite doing enough for me cognitively, I guess I would say. So I kind of switched gears and went and studied psychology. And I had a very pivotal experience as a young person. I was in a car accident where I suffered a stroke. So this really kind of affected my development in terms of emotionally as well as physically. Physically, my left hand is actually partly paralyzed, and so it was really kind of impossible. It was really hard for me to go back to printmaking. Painting and drawing were fine, but printmaking was very hard for me to do. And so I kind of had to switch gears when I kind of made art. I had to start kind of thinking about how can I make the work I want to make. But so in order to do that, I had to think about I need a collaborator. And so the person who became this is actually my husband. We worked together. He actually shot every single photograph, clicked the shutter for every single photograph you see in Completely Human, as well as he's my collaborator in all my films in terms of doing set design, animation, and helping me do camera motion. So what I really want to say about collaboration, if you ever have the opportunity, and if it works out for you, it's actually a really beautiful experience. I've been blessed with this in some way. It's been kind of the blessing of my stroke, and that I've gotten to have this experience where I work with somebody and we talk about ideas and critique things before anything is actually done. And to me, my work has gotten much stronger for that process. I really love the idea of exchange of ideas, especially in the university environment is a great opportunity for that. But when you actually talk one-on-one with somebody, sometimes it can happen to critique. I really feel like work just kind of it gets stronger for it. And so that's kind of how that physically has affected me. Emotionally, the car accident was really traumatic, and I lost my best friend, my grandmother, and my aunt. They died in the accident. And so for me, that kind of installed a sense of the preciousness of life to me, as well as a sense of kind of wanting to draw our attention to things that often go unnoticed. A sense of that kind of, when tragedies happen, how can we kind of reflect those? And so those really kind of things that kind of took on really affected my work in earlier education. This is actually the first photograph I took as an undergrad, where I was really kind of exploring the vulnerability of the body, and the sense that that's actually my left hand that's extended, and kind of how it kind of got a little warped and shaped from the car accident. There's another photograph I took as an undergrad. So I actually, when I started working in photography, instead of kind of working outward and photographing the landscape or things that were kind of given to me naturally, I came inward. And that felt really natural to me to use my body as a available subject. And for reasons mostly because I felt comfortable with myself. I think I was so used to working with my hands and being physical, then turning the camera on myself just felt like I kind of was redoing that process in a different way. And so I started kind of thinking about, I'd have ideas in my head, shots in my mind, so we would reconstruct those, kind of thinking about upsetting events that had taken place and a sense of kind of this uncomfortableness of the body, and acting out those scenes in my mind. In graduate school, I kind of had to change a shift, actually. I did a lot more where I isolated the body. I don't have actually any photographs from graduate school where you see my full body like you do in Completely Human. I kind of focused on little narrow snippets of the body and kind of interaction a lot with kind of knives and kind of metal, as you see in this image called Poker. And to me, I feel like these images are a little bit more subtler in their content and not quite as graphic as the images in Completely Human. And I was really interested in also focusing on light. It was really important to me at the time to make beautiful imagery. I really kind of wanted that sense of the beauty of the photograph, a sense of light and how the light can feel really beautiful and natural, and also the sense of the body in terms of light. And it's actually a photograph of my left hand kind of being distorted in the water, but I wanted that sense of the disturbingness of what was taking place with a sense of beauty to kind of bring those two together. For me, this work that I made in undergrad was really kind of crucial to where I am today. It's actually a photograph of my knees, which shows some scars from the car accident. And I feel like I had to make these images where I explore these isolated parts of my body that were so altered and it just didn't feel like my own because they had been changed by this experience I was involved in order to get to the place where I am now. I was very uncomfortable with my body at the time in terms of how it had been changed. I was really unhappy with my hand, like why would it not work properly? And I also was uncomfortable with the physical change that happened to my body. And so I had to kind of make these isolated images to kind of get to a place where I could be okay with who I am now. And I think that Completely Human would not exist if I had not taken the time to kind of explore that and photograph it. And that's kind of where I am today. I don't have an issue with my body in terms of all those changes. I also feel like the series has a more overt anger to it as well, as opposed to now it's a little bit more subtle in contact. I did a lot with artist books in graduate school. I went to a graduate school where we had to study photography, film, as well as artist books. And so I did a lot with text as image. And to me, I was really interested in putting text directly into a photograph and seeing how that changed the contextual narrative of what you interpreted the image to be. And so especially with this photograph, renewal is something we think about as rebirth and a beginning, something that's kind of positive, and I don't really think the image is particularly positive. So I kind of like that juxtaposition of those two kind of opposing forces, kind of adding further ambiguity to the work. This is a series that I did in grad school, which is composed of 6 photographs, and I actually consider it to be an artist book. And what it is that they're about 17 by 14. They would actually be displayed on the wall. That's why it's called Vane's wall book. And I was really interested in, again, working with text, and how I actually took this image was the image that's being held by my feet. It's actually a page of a book that I printed. I started off by taking images of my body, again, kind of doing pieces of them, then putting them into Photoshop, and I overlaid images from the Grey's Anatomy that I had scanned, and then I went in with text. What I did is then print that page onto matte paper, and I went into it with pastels and charcoal, and drew on it, and then kind of extended that onto my body, where I drew onto my body, and then made these constructed backgrounds. And I really loved the physicality of working with the materials at that time. It was really important to me to kind of bring in fine art into photography, but also I really loved the idea of mixing up that use of language with image to see how each kind of informed the other and kind of changed the reading of the work. And especially in this image, this is one of my more favorite ones from this series, and I really love the casual use of language. It must be nice is a fairly casual statement. That kind of included with the word fuck, which is a pretty strong word. I kind of like the mixing of those two, and also then the full frontal nudity of the female figure, which kind of emulates sense of sex. And so I kind of like that casualness of the language mixed with the imagery. Kind of a push-pull to me. This is my first kind of use of abandoned spaces in graduate school. It's actually interesting to me to kind of reflect back on this because it's the first time I took myself out of the photograph. I actually did this full series from a friend's barn. They had this beautiful old barn, and I kind of went into it and explored it. And I didn't take a single photograph where I actually was in it myself. So Completely Human is actually really interesting to me looking back at this older work where I actually have myself in these kind of more abandoned places. And so what I did with this work is I think it's kind of a much more gentler, quieter side to my my artistic practice. This is actually a Van Dyke print where I actually made the emulsion mixed the emulsion, put it on the paper, made a large format negative, and then made the image that way. I also went into the negative with markers and kind of altered the image. Like that staff behind that kind of creepy guy should actually be printed black, and I went and changed that to make it kind of printed in the negative. So I did a lot of drawing on the negatives with these. I was kind of, again, bringing drawing back to photography. And to me, I was focusing a lot more on inanimate objects and also kind of exploring the relationship between those objects. For this is a traditional silver gelatin print where I'm really kind of exploring a sense of isolation and loneliness. And what I think is interesting looking at this photograph is the subject that's missing. You know, we don't have the child, the little girl that possibly could be related to this photograph. Here we have this bound up doll. And what I'm kind of doing here is kind of the beginning of me talking about upsetting events having taken place with no clear answers as to what happened. You know, how did this doll get to this location? Why is she tied up this way? And what is this little tricycle with all these strange little vines wrapping around it? What does it actually really mean? And I kind of don't really answer any of those questions in the image. I actually revisit this bound character in Completely Human, which I'll show you in a little bit. This is the last photograph I took in that series where I completely took all subjects out of the image, and I think it's an absolutely beautiful photograph, but I think that's really all it is to me. To me, it's not interesting personally because I feel like there's nothing really more happening other than a use of light, other than a use of shadow and space, creating a sense of a place. That's all it has to me, the sense of place. And so to me, it had kind of lacked a narrative. So when I moved to Minnesota is kind of when I kind of accumulated all the sense of use of the body and use of place in a theme. I moved, like Emily said, I moved from upstate New York to central Minnesota about 5 years ago, and that was a really hard change for me. I moved from from about 1 million people to a small town of about 6,000, and it was just quite traumatic. I left all of my friends and family, and also a culture that I was quite comfortable with. I'm really not still quite comfortable in Minnesota, and so that really has affected my work in terms of, I think that uncomfortableness comes out in the imagery. And so I actually had a great question during we just had a class. Someone asked me a question, would your work be different if you hadn't moved to central Minnesota? And I think it completely would be different. That really has impacted, especially the series I'm working on currently. And so it's a kind of a prototypical central Minnesota shot. It's, you know, really quiet. There's these great cornfields and a lot of empty places with not a lot of inhabitants, which has been really great for my work because it's kind of I've been able to kind of find these isolated locations and I've been able to really thrive in this environment. Completely Human was greatly influenced by the work of Todd Hitto for a couple of reasons. It's actually a photograph from his portrait series. And to me, his work really implies the other, really implies the male gaze and a sense of victimization. And I actually think his work is quite beautiful, but I think to me it's kind of portraying a fairly stereotypical, straightforward female character we're used to seeing, especially in photography. You know, I actually feel like someone who feels very vulnerable, and I feel like it's a very, very clear, direct narrative. And so my work I consider to be in a direct conversation with his in terms of kind of what I'm exploring. I'm hoping I'm adding a little bit more ambiguity, a little bit more complexity to the characters that I'm presenting, as well as kind of bring some of the images actually bring the male directly into the frame as opposed to just being the voyeur and kind of looking into the scene of female sexuality. This is actually the first photograph I took for Completely Human. I found this wonderful abandoned cornfield, and I actually really terrified the poor woman who owns this cornfield because no one actually comes ever down this street, and she saw my car parked there for a couple of days. I went and did a couple location shots, and she was really, really terrified, so I actually had to take her an offering of bread as a gift to kind of apologize for freaking her out. She almost called the cops, which would have been really horrible, but luckily I caught her in time before she made that phone call. But anyway, so if you're ever going to do photography and you're going to trespass, sometimes I just kind of think it might be better to ask permission before trespassing. That's going to be my new thing, is ask permission beforehand. Anyway, this cornfield was just perfect. And what was perfect for me, because I love that winding road kind of leading off into the middle of nowhere, a sense of impossibility of place and where things could be going. And so it was really crucial to me to find this kind of perfect landscape. And so, like I said, I felt so out of place in this location. What my response was to immerse myself in that place and photograph my response. And to me, this series is very photographic and obviously photographic, but very kind of really cinematic as well. And what I mean by that is I also work in motion media. And to me, they're very similar because, of course, they use light and they use imagery, but they're also very different in really kind of pivotal ways. And for me, film work is very ephemeral. After you've seen a scene, sometimes it's so hard to hold on to that specific shot you just saw. And over time, it can the narrative can kind of change, and things can kind of get embellished or kind of subdued, right? You kind of put you interject your own self into what you possibly would have seen. Whereas still photography, it's time locked, right? It exists, it's in front of you. Not necessarily that the image is truth, but what is presented to you, you cannot refute because it's actually physically in front of you. And so in Completely Human, I'm really interested in kind of that relationship between still photography and film, and what these mean as stills, that they have a truth to them as something that actually took place because it was photographed. And that's really important to me, the idea of truthfulness in that. And so that's kind of what I also feel like there's sort of performances for the camera as well. I also like the idea of the sense of the shot extending beyond the boundaries of the frame. Like an idea of what actually, who are these people? What transpired between these people to get into the situation they are currently? You know, what happened? And what's going to happen after the shot's taken? Is this kind of a basic play acting, or is this actually a dangerous action with larger repercussions that we're not aware of? Something I kind of pose these questions to the viewer. This image is actually a direct response to Todd Hiddos. The character on the right is really reminiscent of some of his female characters that I showed you. But what I'm doing here is like bringing the male actually directly into the scene as opposed to just being the voyeur of the image. I also really like in my work to not have clear identities. That's why I use a lot of masks and kind of hiding of the face. I like the kind of just the male-female interaction, regardless of who they are beyond just being a certain sex. And I really like the idea of a sense of, who are these people, what are their relationship, and what's kind of happening in the scene. And I really like to not tell people what to think in the work. What's interesting to me is that I have these kind of mini-series within Completely Human where I use the same characters. It's actually a different location, but it's the same characters. We still have the kind of controlling male behind me. But then we have, I have that mask on. We've switched roles. And so what does that mean that we kind of switch these roles? And what does that mean in terms of identity, in terms of sexuality and representation? This actually corresponds to the image Emily chose for the exhibition. This was taken at a seed factory, one that I did not ask permission to be at, but was not a problem because I went over the weekend when people were not working. But what I really love about this image is that I'm very interested in interposing and interjecting sexuality with implied danger. To me, I think when we have a sense of arousal, a sense of sex with a sense of danger, things being kind of emotionally disturbing, when those two emotions are mixed, I think it adds far more complexity to what's actually happening. I think as being human, complexity of emotion is what makes us interesting as humans. And so that's kind of what I'm doing, especially in photographs like this. I work in a fairly complicated manner. This is this example of a shot list for some bathroom shots that I did. And what I do is I do a lot of writing before I actually even take a single photograph. I do a lot of writing, then I go and make a spreadsheet in Excel where I have possible variations on shots. And then I actually do a ton of testing. So every single photograph you see actually in the exhibition, there is tons of photographs that you will never see because they're just ended up not being not good shots, or they just were experiments trying to get the shot I want. So I just have this very organized way of working it, and I think to me, I might overthink things, but I'm kind of a person who likes a lot of purposeful work. And so this is how I've kind of gotten to do my work. I want to show an example of a shot that I chose and a shot that I did not choose. The one on the left is the one I actually have in the series. The one on the right, I do not. And sometimes it's a very subtle property that I purposely do not like. And the one on the right, what I don't like is the hands underneath my chin. To me, it felt like that was too casual of a position for the emotional tension and the distraught emotion I wanted to convey in the photograph. I felt like it just felt like not a natural pose. If you've ever cried so hard that you feel like you're just going to die, you can't stand yourself, how does that feel like you want to wring your hair out? Your hands underneath your chin, not quite the same emotional impact. So this is what I do for every photograph I take. I think about, especially after I've kind of taken some practice shots, is my body language communicating what I want to say in the image? And that's really important to me. That's where I think they're a little bit like performance, a little bit like acting, method acting in a lot of ways, trying to really communicate what I want to say through my body. When I've gotten to this stage, I've already done tons of testing in terms of lighting, camera angle, depth of field, all those kind of basic camera photographic principles, as well as set design. This is actually not my real bathroom. My shower curtain is different than that. And the sink, actually, I have a sterling silver sink, which was too highly reflective for the shot. Took it out, went to the hardware store, got this one, put it in, took the shot, took the sink back. So I do a lot of, I know, I didn't feel bad because it was just like installed for like a couple of days. But we never actually turned the water on, so we didn't have a sink in our bathroom for a couple of days while we were working on the shot. But I feel like to me, set design is a really crucial component to my photographic practice. So it's actually one of the more humorous photographs to me. I find this photograph very funny. It might be my sense of humor is a bit off, but you know, I like the impossibility of the shot, you know, the sense of smoking with the head covered, and I like the kind of bound, you know, noosed head. This is actually where the red started showing up in my series. And actually, Emily and I had a great conversation about a year ago about the color red in some of my work. And I use it for a couple of reasons, primary two. One being that you know, it's a highly visible, intense color. It's really saturated. It pulls your eye around the picture plane. That's kind of one reason why I use it. I also use it because, and to me, in popular culture, especially when it's associated with women, is a sense of sex, a sense of being available, right? Being kind of ready. And so I kind of use it for that purpose as well. And what I said about, you know, this kind of mini-series within Completely Human, this is actually revisiting that bound doll that you saw in some of my graduate photos in the barn. I consider this to be like kind of a mini-series with this character. Here's something else is happening to her. She's exploring some other idea, and the sense of kind of that, you know, she's strangling herself. You know, kind of what is like the psychological component of that. But I really like when more is happening with a similar character to kind of see, you know, what is actually occurring. And this is where it kind of gets to be a little like film for me. If we think of these as kind of stills of a larger narrative, right? What's happening in the shots that we're not seeing? You know, how did this character get to where she was in that garage, strangling herself, and here she's bound and tied in this kind of basement area. So I'm very interested in thinking about having that come into a little bit of illusionary of memory, you know, and also, you know, memory and also fantasy, you know, thinking about what could have happened and transpired that we actually got to this place that we are now. So kind of a lot that I'm interested in a lot happening that's not actually present in the frame. Currently I'm working a little closer to home, and that being that we're kind of getting it's getting a little cold in Minnesota. Minnesota is unbearably cold in winter, and I mean unbearably cold. So I will not be going outside for the next 5 months soon. I'll be bound to my house, and so I'm doing a lot of work in my house. And a couple of things I'm interested in doing is kind of further exploring that learned helplessness and perpetration that I'm showing in this image. I'm really interested in that kind of resignation to the abuse that's kind of taking place, but also, so I think that there's some power, sometimes a resignation that sometimes gets overlooked actually. This is a photograph that I took a couple months ago, and what I'm really interested in here is the interplay of intimacy, and when intimacy slightly goes awry. A student had a question in the previous class about, you know, my husband's identity. It's my husband who serves as a subject occasionally, about where his line that he would cross being in my photographic work. He's a psychology professor, and so no nudity is our rule, and so we have it just cut off at the right space, the right spot there, that he's safe for this image. But anyway, what I'm doing here is a sense of, you know, emotional intimacy and emotional isolation. So I'm kind of taking the isolation I feel in the landscape in terms of these isolated kind of abandoned locations, bringing that into the home in terms of emotional isolation and emotional distance between two people. And when you're kind of in this kind of enclosed space, especially in Minnesota, which I think things can get really kind of crazy, when it's like -25 and you're stuck in the house and you can't get out and you're together for so long, what kind of horrible things could happen that no one else would know about because nobody comes to see you for months because no one leaves their own house. So that's kind of what I'm kind of doing in this image. And this is an image I took 2 weeks ago, actually, in my own backyard. And what I'm kind of interested in doing now is a couple things, pushing the envelope, what I can do in my own yard. I live in kind of a suburban subdivision, so it's really kind of weird to live in a town of no one, but I have a little teeny neighborhood I live in where there's a lot of people. And so I'm curious to see how far I can push the public nudity in my own little tiny yard, as well, and what's socially acceptable. And also kind of creating like my own kind of sense of isolation based on how I use the camera, right? What I really love about this photograph to me is it's kind of, there's not a real sense of space and place in terms of, are the vines on top of her? Is she standing and then the vines are in front of her? So I kind of like that sense of not having any visual cues as to what the environment is. And so I'm trying to see what I can do in my own yard, going only a few steps into the backyard and seeing how I can create this illusion of isolation, even though I'm actually really not going anywhere. I'm actually a pretty populated area for my little area. So, and see how far I can push the physical component, what would be socially acceptable in my own backyard. So that's pretty much all I have to say. I would love to hear any questions if anyone has anything to ask. Yeah.
It's more about, you talked about how cold it gets. Would you ever think about exploring the cold and the nudity and subject matter of that, because a lot of people don't like to go outside when it's
Right.
cold, especially nude, and
Right.
how the body changes
Uh-huh,
and reacts to that.
Yeah,
Would you ever
yeah.
think about exploring that?
The wood shot, which is the one where I'm tied up in the red rope, that was actually the end of November. That was the coldest I've ever been outside. And the reason that there's so much red on my skin is because my skin was actually got some frostbite. So I think there's probably a threshold that is safe and probably a threshold that's not safe. But I think it's a very interesting question because I have thought about, and I'm trying to think about what I could tolerate physically and trying to see if I can do a little bit more with that. 'Cause I think it's very interesting to think about because the body it feels so unnatural. So it might even get further at the idea of the kind of uncomfortableness of the nudity in the environment. So I think there could be something there, maybe like in my backyard where I could quickly run into the house to get warm. But that shot was so painful. The one in the woods, because I could barely walk. I pretty much couldn't walk to the car. We were in the woods in this isolated area, and I was just so cold. It just because it was like, 20 degrees. So yeah, but that's a really great question. Something I'm sort of kind of playing with. Yeah, nice idea. Yeah.
These are self-portraits. I read that in the essay. So do these reflect some part of your personality, or do you use your body as a model for the message that you're trying to get across?
Yeah, I don't think of them personally as self-portraits. I think I use my body as an available subject, and for a couple of reasons. I would never be comfortable asking a woman to do these images. Because I think some of them are kind of abusive. They're actually physically uncomfortable, a lot of them, especially when I was tied up with the rope. I had, rope marks on my body for the next couple days. So they're physically taxing sometimes to be in these positions, especially some of the construction sites. My whole body would go numb from sitting in a certain position for so long. So I never would ask anyone else to do that. I feel like that would be abusive to ask somebody to do that. And so I guess that's kind of maybe masochistic. I would rather views myself in that way than have somebody else be used by that way. There are obviously things in terms of self-portraiture, there are obviously things I think about. So they're obviously coming from my mind. So in that way, they could be kind of psychological portraits, but not portraits of me in the traditional sense of portraiture, if that makes sense, if that answers your question. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I had a question about the installation process.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that you did the installation with magnets,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to know if that tied any further into like the subject matter of the work, if they meant to be fleeting, or if it was just a choice that you made, or because I kind of enjoy the idea of it being like a fleeting thought, like stuff you put on your refrigerator at home, removed and replaced.
Yeah, exactly. I like the sense of the images being sort of dispensable because some of the events that are taking place are there's a throwaway feeling to some of them, there's a casualness to some of them, which I'm kind of playing with that idea. So yes, very much so. I mean, it's exactly what you said. Sounds like almost being like posters you could hang up in a dorm. Yeah, very much. Mm-hmm.
What's the worst response you've gotten as far as how people react to the work?
This series in particular?
Yeah.
That's pornographic and that it shouldn't be made.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty light.
That's pretty light? Oh, yeah? What would be more intense? I'm just curious.
That it shouldn't be made and it's pornographic. That would be worse.
Okay. Yeah, they made it pretty clear it shouldn't be made, that I should not be doing it.
Were they educated though?
Yeah, it actually is, yeah. It's actually from two really highly educated people. One person has a law degree and the other person has a master's in literature. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for coming and for breaking all sorts of fire codes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
There's cake and we'll be around.
How was it? It was really good. Okay.
Took a lot longer than you thought you were going to.
How long was it?